thank you all for coming. This is pretty remarkable. Let me formally welcome you to the now third annual workshop on fairness, accountability, and transparency in machine learning. My name is Solon Barokis. I'm a postdoc researcher at Microsoft Research. And I just want to take a moment to reflect on the fact that this has become a relatively large community. This workshop started a little less than 3 years ago as a relatively intimate affair at NIPS 2014, where a colleague who unfortunately couldn't be here today, Moritz Hart, and I tried to bring together some people from within computer science, but also in law and policy and social sciences, to kind of reflect on these questions that were becoming urgent policy questions, but also, I think, interesting and urgent technical questions. And that conversation in the initial meeting actually led to a kind of ongoing discussion among a number of people who then later became members of the organizing committee, all of whom, with the exception of Moritz, are actually here in the room. We staged another event at ICML last year, which kind of brought together a number of people who had been working on this topic largely in Europe and in East Asia, to try to bridge what is sort of becoming an American-style, North American-style conversation about these issues with a longer-standing conversation that was happening in Europe and elsewhere. And I don't think I have to say that this event takes place at a pretty unique moment. I did not anticipate that we'd be having this conversation in the political context of today. And it made me think that perhaps this wasn't the right time for this conversation, that there are more basic issues to attend to. But I actually think that this is, in fact, a great time to be investing in these issues, and to be doing so perhaps not only as questions of politics, but questions of technical practice, of kind of basic research questions within computer science. And I'm really, really quite excited about the program that we have for today. There's a number of different things over the course of the day. The first will be an opening panel, and we'll also end the day with a closing panel. But in between, we have a couple of interesting different things. We'll have a spotlight session, which I guess you can see here on the slide, which is basically kind of rapid fire sequence of talks relating to what the kind of group of people organizing the event perceived as some of the best published work from this past year. Then we'll have morning and afternoon sessions, which will feature both some existing work, presentations of existing work, but a lot of new work as well. And we've tried to pair these in ways where they'll speak to each other, where the different research that will be presented addresses each other. We'll also have this is actually a really exciting last minute addition to the program. If you take a look at, actually, let me see if I can do this. Yeah, well, in any event, here in New York City, we have a special regulatory agency called the Commission on Human Rights, which has interesting legal authority on topics related to discrimination and bias. And we are fortunate enough to actually have the chair and commissioner of that agency here today to actually address the group. And that will be a short address right before lunch. She'll share some thoughts about these issues and describe how the agency might be able to address some of these things. Hopefully, I think, in partnership with many of the people in this room. The other thing we'll have during lunch, which will be catered so everyone can stick around for lunch, is an excellent poster session. So perhaps you saw as you walked in, there was a room on the opposite side of this room, which is actually a nice space for posters. And so we'll have 9 posters. And we encourage everyone to have some food about 30 minutes after we have lunch. During that same hour-and-a-half break for lunch, we'll then have an hour-long session for the posters. And I highly encourage everyone to stop in to see those. So that's really the course of the day. I just want to say a few quick thank yous before I hand it over to the incoming panel. So first, I just want to thank my co-organizers who have been incredibly helpful in putting this all together, both this year and in previous years, and in just helping to kind of foster this community. We also had a program committee for the first time this year, which included many people in this room, and we're very, very grateful for their hard work. I also want to thank New York Law School, New York University Law School, for providing us with this venue. And specifically, I want to call out some people, Nicole Arts, who you probably dealt with when you first walked in, some student volunteers, Yuli and Casey, also who you met when you probably walked in, Amanda Lewandowski, who I think may be somewhere in the room as well, who was helpful in putting this all together, and Jason Schultz, who is really the person who made it possible to secure this venue. I also want to just quickly thank our sponsors, which includes the Data Transparency Lab, whose events took place yesterday and the day before. And I want to call out Augustine, who was very helpful in trying to arrange space for us at Columbia before we had to actually relocate. And finally, I just want to also thank our two other sponsors, major sponsors, who really have provided some important financial support, which is Microsoft, where I am currently employed, and Google, as well as some other folks in the room. So with that, thank you all for coming. It's going to be, I think, a really interesting and engaging day. Please, if anyone has any questions, pull me aside. And if you don't find me, there will be someone stationed at the entrance all day long, too. But thanks very much. I'm now going to pass it over to Dana Boyd, who many of you I'm sure know. She is a principal researcher at Microsoft Research and also the founder of Data and Society. She is going to be the moderator, but also a panelist in her own right on the opening panel, and I'll invite her up right now.
I'm going to ask the other panelists to come join me up here. So I am honored and delighted to be here. I am, like Solon, I'm so excited that there's so much energy here. And our goal for this opening panel is to get people started about what is FatML, what's the state of the field, where are we going, and how should we be thinking about it? And so the way that this is going to work is I'm going to ask my fellow panelists to basically provide some provocative opening statements, to sort of say where they're at, and to actually in many ways challenge you to think critically as you engage throughout the day. And then I will ask some questions and we will open up to questions. So this will be a good opportunity for everyone to engage. I say that in advance because you should feel free to write down your questions and think about what you want to ask. And to note that I'm not going to let you ask them from the floor. You've got to actually go and to a microphone, because we do have a live stream, because this has indeed exploded far beyond the basic interests of this room, which is kind of exciting. So first, a moment of introduction. To my right is Sorelle Friedler, who is a assistant professor at Haverford and is also visiting. She was a fellow with me at Data and Society, so we've played for a long time. Next is Raed Ghani from the University of Chicago, and then we have Cynthia Rudin from MIT.
Duke.
Oh, Duke, sorry. Whoa, I didn't get that update. Thank you. From Duke, I'm sorry. That was very nice. And they'll each tell a little bit more about where they're at and where they're starting from. And so I was asked by Solon to also provide some of my own provocative statements to the room as part of this as a quasi member of the panel. So I'll get started first and then turn it over to my fellow panelists. The two provocative things that I wanted to offer to this room is first the notion that transparency, which obviously is the T in FatML, as it's currently constructed outside of the technical community, has become a red herring, and in many ways is going to be a problem for us as a field. And I'll come back to that in a second. The second comment that I want to make is that machine learning requires a form of precision that society isn't really prepared for, which complicates the tension between the FAT and the ML. So let me start with that notion of transparency. So what is happening is that transparency is moved with it in a broader notion of accountability. In fact, they often come together, where there's the assumption within broader political discourse that if we have transparency, we will have accountability. And that becomes a challenge in its own right, because it ends up being this moment where we obsess over just achieving transparency without really realizing the relationship between transparency and accountability. Something that the technical community understands how to separate, but is not actually separable within the broader political element. Transparency of data and algorithms is often assumed to be the desired end goal, and many people in this room would be like, of course not, that's insane. But part of what's at stake right now is that as that notion of transparency starts to go out and become part of broader environments, I would argue it's becoming a distraction. what ends up happening is we get so focused on the mechanisms that are about trying to achieve transparency that we lose a broader picture in what's going on. And importantly, we start to lose the notion of trade-offs. What are we actually trading off when we make some of these decisions? The other thing that I sort of struggle with on a regular basis is when and where is transparency a new mechanism for enabling manipulation? And I think that there's an interesting moment to think about, because a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about accountability and transparency and fairness are these moments where we're trying to remedy against moments of manipulation for conflicting value statements. This is where I think we get to have an interesting conversation about values. To my second statement, that machine learning requires a form of precision that society isn't prepared for, a lot of it is we've started to see some of these really fascinating debates about what is necessary to even define fairness. In fact, there's so many people in this room who've been having a really good conversation about the mathematical definitions of fairness. And warning for anybody who isn't familiar with the social science and philosophical literature, that's been debated for thousands of years. So if y'all figure it out, please, that's awesome for everybody. But note that this is a very contested term, because what's at stake, of course, is that we're grappling with values. And we're grappling with values that the rule of law has long tried to figure out how to formalize in different sort of structures with huge challenges. And one of the things that's intriguing about how the rule of law tries to operationalize this is that it often leaves room for flexibility. That room for flexibility is, of course, where huge challenges of bias and discrimination start to enter the picture, where values start to enter the picture. And it's one thing, my guess is many of you in this room have jaywalked in the last 7 days, right? And it's a really good thing that you didn't get fined every time you did something illegal, because if you actually looked at what you've done recently, there's a lot of illegal activity in there. And some of it, you don't even realize. My favorite ridiculous law is you cannot bicycle in a swimming pool. Who knew? I'm sure many of you haven't tried that this week, but it's an interesting moment to think about those little subtle elements. And I say this because we require a level of precision when we're putting something into code that law has often left room for fuzziness. So what is the kind of fuzziness that we want to start talking about? And what happens when we start to go to precision? And what are the consequences of that? Because in some ways, fuzziness is where we actually allow for a meaningful sense of judgment. And the questions of fairness often come and become human questions. So as we think about what the role of the human in the loop is, a lot of it has to do with that fuzziness. So those are my two provocations for the day. And I'm going to turn it over to Sorel and see what she's got.
Thanks. Where you sort of ended thinking about questions of fairness and how that's long been contested within social sciences is sort of where I want to pick up. Because as Dana mentioned, within this community, we've been thinking a lot about what it means to be fair and what the appropriate mathematical way of framing that question is. And there have been a bunch of different answers to that. And they have their various nuances, but I'm going to sort of broadly characterize them as being in two basic camps. Right. One is sort of the camp that's sometimes known as group fairness or non-discrimination, and it's coming out of I would sort of place it in this historical context as sort of coming out of the civil rights movement, of saying that it's important that that groups coming from different backgrounds still have the same opportunity in the world. And these are often sort of outcomes-focused measures, right? So these are measures that sort of say, if we find that black people and white people are hired for a job at the same rate, then we'll consider that to have been fair. And if we find that those rates are largely different, then we'll say that that was unfair. On the other hand, there is a whole body of work that is more concerned with sort of the rights of the individual, which has sometimes in our community been termed individual fairness. And these are ideas that are saying that people should be judged by their individual merits. And what I want to draw out here is that I think that obviously both of these options are value choices. And I think that on the sort of group fairness, non-discrimination side, people are often more clear about the fact that these are value choices and a little bit more transparent, saying these are my values and now I'm going to mathematize them and go ahead and try to optimize towards this definition. I think that people in our community on the individual fairness side, this is my provocation, have been a little bit less clear about stating that these are also value-driven assumptions. And I think that, I hope that we can all sort of state our values up front. And I think that the sort of subtle value stated there is that the data is correct, right? that when we are given sort of a, a CSV of a bunch of data, that it somehow represents truth, right? And not just, some observation of truth as it was written down in potentially noisy measurements into some spreadsheet that potentially left off some stuff and included some additional stuff, and right. So you can sort of see where on the value side I land on this, but I think that it's important to sort of be transparent about that value system and to say, if I'm going to go ahead and choose this set of definitions, what I'm implicitly assuming is that my data is correct. And then if we all agree that the data is correct, then we can all sort of move on and say, let's gather around that definition. And if we don't agree that it sort of represents some underlying truth with respect to the task that we're trying to determine, then maybe we should, come to some other sort of remedies. But my hope is that we in the room can start to move the conversation to that place so that we can actually move it forward beyond that.
Thank you. Right?
So, as the minority on the panel, which I'm really happy about in many ways, I'm sure all of us can take different sides of this, so I'm going to take a different side. And I think, we're all sort of here assuming that we're so influential and so powerful that all these people are making decisions based on machine learning and data, and they're so rational, and we have to stop them from being accidentally unfair or accidentally, non-transparent. Well, the reality is, they're not doing much with data, especially when you go, if you're looking at sort of the large companies and hiring biases and Google and Facebook, true. If you're looking at, people that are being affected, public health and criminal justice system and people who are being unfairly treated by the police, none of those people are using data to make any decision. So we're worried about fairness and accountability and transparency when we should be worried about slightly better use of data. So when I sort of do these things, I sort of, part of me wants to be a cheerleader. We're just trying to get them, just use any data. I don't care, just start being better than today. That's the baseline. Better than today is the baseline with constraints on, and the other side is trying to scare them into, when you start doing that, you start running into the issues that, Sorel and Dana talked about, is because the people who are doing this work today with data are not trained to think about those issues. So they take, IID and data is perfect and make easy. So kind of I have this, schizophrenic personality where I'm trying to scare them and saying, don't do too much, but do a little bit. And I think it depends on what group you're in. You want to take one or the other side. So I think it's important for us to not just go to them and say, hey, data is scary. If you use data, you're going to make really bad decisions. It's going to be horrible. So don't do anything, because that's how they take it, right? If you sort of talk to governments and nonprofits, a lot of them are really scared about using any data, which means they're doing things that are unfair, accidentally, that can't be audited, that can't be measured. So that's one thing I think. I think the second thing is I think we have to be a little bit more explicit in what are we trying to protect, right? So the way I think about it is, for a long time, we had kind of control of what data we collected about people. And then from there, we moved on to what inferences. So everything about privacy is not, so security and access control is typically around sort of what data is collected and who can access it. Then there's sort of inference control, right? Where what can you infer from that data, and that's sort of most privacy is. I think what we're talking about now, I'm assuming most of us don't care about, some of us care about fairness and transparency as a theoretical construct, but most of us care about how it affects people. So what we want to do is figure out action control, who is being acted upon unfairly. I can make unfair inferences about people, and I can't stop anyone from doing that. But what I can do is control the action, right? So the jaywalking example Dana is giving, yes, there's some fuzziness there, but if the probability of somebody getting a ticket for jaywalking is different for white people versus black people, that's the thing we need to control. We can't control some of the other things. So I think we should kind of be very explicit on, let's not try to stop people from doing everything. Let's try to get them to figure out, you can do whatever you want, but at the end, you need to be transparent on some of these things. And I think one thing you can be transparent on is this exactly, it's what's the probability of action. That gets to some of the precision, but you can have a range and a distribution and all of those different things. And then I think the third piece I want to sort of prompt people to think about is, most of us in this room are not going to be affected too dramatically, again, it might be an unfair statement, by a lot of these things we're talking about, right? So maybe we should talk to the people who are being affected by all of this, instead of us making the rules and us sort of asserting, this might hurt people. Well, maybe we should ask somebody who's going to be affected by it, you know, you could be unfair to you, but it could help all these people. Like, how about you tell us what your preferences are, and we design kind of these policies that are much more collaborative and much more focused on the people affected by it than the people sort of designing them and kind of talking about them in this room.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to follow up on something Ray said, which was that people are not using data to create models because they just haven't done that in the past. And so they've started to do it, but the way they've done it has been a little bit alarming, at least to me. Like, the government started hiring companies to produce predictions for them, and the company gets paid every time it makes a prediction. And these are black box predictions because otherwise the company wouldn't get paid, right? So, you know, should I give this person parole or bail? Should I give a person bail? Okay, so they hire this company, and the company says, we think this person is dangerous, so you should not give them bail. And then, since we can't figure out what exactly the company is doing, and their predictions are clearly unfair, there's a lot of documentation on this. I find this very disturbing. Why is our government paying this private company to produce predictions that nobody can explain? There should not be a business model for this. We need to erase that business model and instead create a business model around designing transparent models, or at least models that you can explain. Because I agree that transparency is not the same as accountability, but if it's not transparent, it's very difficult for people to be accountable for their decisions. You have no reasons for them. One thing I should say also is not only is accountability a little bit different than transparency, causality is different than transparency. Every time, like, I work on, designing transparent models, machine learning models, and every time I put up a model that people can understand, all of a sudden they start protesting, and then which is great because it means that they can understand what's going on. But then once they sort of understand what the model's doing, they go, oh, well, does that mean if I change this, then the prediction is different? It's like, no, you're not allowed to do that because it's not a causal model. So you have to actually, you have to think about causality when you're designing these things because you realize that people are going to misinterpret what they are. The other thing I wanted to talk about is computational hardness. Transparency in modeling is tied inherently to computational hardness. If you want to put a constraint on, like a fairness constraint, you have to be willing to solve a computationally hard problem. And because a lot of people in this field are not willing to do that, it sort of pushes the computational hardness onto the users. So then you have, like, doctors and people designing criminal justice models who are trying to do manual feature selection because they can't deal with the computational hardness problem. And I feel like that is our fault because, computational hardness is something we should handle, not to push it onto the users. Okay.
No, thank you, guys. So one of the things I'm hearing from each of you in different ways is this moment in which data is understood or not understood in relationship to broader social issues as we're seeing it play out. Right? You made it very clear that people are not even knowing how to use data. They don't understand it, and so they're going with their gut in many ways in these environments. So it's a moment where can data be just a little bit better? Sorel, you've talked about this tension that we have between group fairness and individual fairness, and this way in which we don't even necessarily understand how to take the data that we have to situate in that model. And Cynthia, your point about causality is this reminder that we don't even have really basic mathematical literacy, let alone more sophisticated technical literacies. So how do we think then about the role of the efforts in FATML, which in many ways are technical efforts with a social implication? What is the role of this community to grapple with the ways in which, frankly, as a result of this, a lot of this stuff can be misused? A lot of the kinds of implementations and the tools that we see being built can be misused if people don't know how to read the material, if they don't know, if they're going to misuse it because they're just going to black box it, or if they're going to do it without even necessarily thinking through the values. How do we challenge that?
That's a good question.
So I think one, don't have a good answer, but one way of, at least the way I think about it is, just like when machine learning and a lot of technologies get started, they don't get started from, governments and people doing they get started from people who have the resources, have the luxury of having the data, and a luxury of not making too many important decisions, like lots of micro decisions. What ad do I show people? Who cares? But the benefit of that is you've got tons of data, and you've got tons of, you do care because it does affect people, and you've shown. So don't take anything I say too literally, by the way, because I could argue the other side. So I think one thing we can do is use those, there must be a use to those companies, right? A lot of people here work for those. So can we use them to test out these ideas to see what needs to be developed? How do they work? As opposed to going directly to the criminal justice world and saying, we're going to make you fair and transparent. Well, first we have to make them slightly more rational, and then we have to make them fair and transparent. But if we go to the people who claim to be rational and start using them as a testing ground for fairness and transparency and accountability, and then, I don't know if things will trickle down, but I think that's one hope that I have is, let's start playing in the sandbox that those organizations already have, and figure out what frameworks need to be there, what challenges we need to solve, what are the algorithms we need to develop, what are the theoretical work we need to do and empirically verify, and then go down to the problems where it's really sensitive, because you also don't want to experiment too much in some of those other domains, because you want to go there knowing that it's somewhat safe and that your experiments aren't going to be unfair. So that's kind of my view, is use the large ad search, useless domains, and use them for testing. Get something good out of them, right? And then push them down to other areas.
So I think another thing that comes up from this, in some ways, FANML is values first, right? And that ends up being the frame of so much of what this entire community is about. But there's some implicit assumptions within those values, that those values are in many ways progressive, that those values are in many ways thinking about broader societal elements. And yet, as Cynthia, you pointed out, one of the big challenges is that we're also dealing with a set of values that are economics first, right? Business models first, which is in some ways where the challenge is occurring. There's also places where I would say that things are even more contested. Folks don't agree on what criminal justice should serve as a purpose, right? Like there's very deep conflicts within criminology about what that even means. So how do we start dealing and grappling with conflicts in values? One of it, which I think you pointed out, is like it's about making some of this visible. But part of what's also going to come in line is that there's moments where those elements are actually just going to be themselves political. And so what is the responsibility from this community when we're facing areas where we're talking about serious and deep entrenched conflict in values, where in many ways that's not necessarily what we're skilled to be working out for people? You mentioned about getting communities to be engaged as part of this, but there's also which communities, right? Because I think that this is what's coming up. So maybe, Cynthia, starting with you, is like, how do we think about that? One of the things is that we're coming up against an economic desire first and foremost. How do we deal with that tension at play?
Yeah, I don't know exactly how to deal with it, but one thing I've noticed is that all of a sudden everybody is doing machine learning, regardless of whether they're trained in it. Like, I've noticed, like, even at universities I've been at, all of a sudden there's machine learning classes in several different departments. And who's teaching these classes? I don't know those people. Why do I not know those people?
I think it's called AI now.
Okay, yeah, all right. So, like, it's just, something gets hot, and then everybody decides that they're qualified to do this, and like this company that's producing these predictions, what the heck are they doing? Are they trained in machine learning? I have no idea. Maybe they just got some off-the-shelf, like, who knows what, and they're producing predictions. I mean, it would be good if the community would start putting out statements that people could listen to, written statements.
part of it is you want to see the community articulate its own values.
I think so. I think that would help, because right now it's just like this Wild West, like, oh, let's all do machine learning and get money for it, you know, so.
Well, I think it ironically becomes accountability people, right? Like, this
I guess
the
so.
twisted element of like, how do we actually hold accountable? What are those values that are being articulated?
Yeah, and I feel like I should jump in here and say that, in fact, some of that has started happening within this community. And there have now been, a couple of workshops that have been held to try to say, what are our principles, right? Or what do we believe are sort of principles of accountability within algorithms? And one of the results of that was posted on the website for FATML like last night.
So everyone, I'm sure you looked at it. You have computers. Now is the time. Sorry. No, but I think it's, I think one of the places where I think we've seen it most recently is I want to talk about the ProPublica article and the sort of different reactions to it. And I know we have a piece, or at least one piece, maybe two pieces later today discussing some of this. For those who didn't see it, ProPublica released an analysis of a risk assessment tool that was used in Broward County, where they looked at solely at the output of it and looked at the disparate impact of the different analyses, the black box, if you will, and came to the conclusion that black individuals who were not likely to commit a crime were more likely to be given a high risk score and therefore face greater punishment through the criminal justice system up front than white individuals. The company itself, North Point Compass, or North Point was the company, the tools Compass, sort of came out with a response and said, actually, no, that's not how we were modeling this. And what unfolded was a series of debates that happened both within technical communities, and there's some great papers on Archive, as well as all the way up through the Washington Post, trying to articulate out different definitions of fairness. And maybe, Ray, you can speak to some of this. It's just like, how do we deal with what in many ways was that fundamental difference in what should be done with criminal justice, that in many ways was disconnected from the communities, because actually what's at stake is we're not even sure who we're talking about in criminology and what is the role? Is the community, judges? Is the community, those who have been scored in different ways? And how do we deal with that? Because in many ways, and this goes to your other point, which is that judges aren't even sure what to do with that data half the time, right? So they're not even necessarily using it. But if we're pushing for these things to be used, how do we deal with that when we're actually seeing that there's not even agreement on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so the last year or so, spending a lot of time with people doing criminal justice work, and again, I think that the challenge there is a lot of these systems are there for the reason for them being there is sort of consistency, not fairness. Right? So, okay, judges are really, they're subjective, and so if we give them a consistent thing, they will make similar decisions every time, so you reduce the variance, but who knows where the mean goes, right? And so I think there is part of that. So there is this, for bail, there is very few companies, very few jurisdictions are using that system. Most of them are using, or the more progressive ones use this scorecard where they score different things with numbers and they have to add them up, and numbers greater than X, then you're high risk, otherwise you're not. So what's happening is there's all this, perception of using this information, and then you talk to the people who are doing sentencing. You talk to a judge. So I was talking to somebody in Salt Lake County a couple of months ago, and they said, well, there was a time of the city where there was one of the G20 summits was happening, and because the G20 summit was happening, they were expecting to arrest a bunch of people. So they started releasing people from jails just pretty randomly, just so that they could make space. So that when new people are going to be arrested, we should start putting them in, right? So we talked about, and the reason that came up was we're talking about the data, and I said, well, we should be careful because the same person, everything else being equal, two people have different probabilities of being sentenced into jail because of the capacity of the jail. And when we're doing this type of work, we never look at the capacity of the jail. We look at everything else but what's happening inside the jail. So even those types of things where judges are making these sentencing decisions based on this information, is that fair? Who's it? It might be transparent, and who are being fair too, and how are you dealing with that issue? So I think on the criminal justice side, there are so many big issues there, right? We've got a quarter of the world's prison population is in the U.S. Most people who are most people probably don't even know the difference between jails and prisons. But most people who are in jails right now have chronic health issues, substance abuse disorders. I mean, there's sort of all these other things that we have to deal with. And so I think there is, on the fairness side, sometimes it's fairer to put somebody unfairly into, especially in some cases a prison, because they have long-term support services that can actually help you if designed correctly. And sometimes judges are looking and saying, does this person have safe and secure housing and a stable employment? And if they don't have those things, maybe we should put them in a place where they can get extra support so that the outcomes for them could be better. So I think there is, when I'm talking about being involved in the community, are the people who are being affected there, right? So let's figure out what's the best outcome for these people together with these people, as opposed to us telling them what they should be doing. And then let's think about sort of fairness and transparency and accountability sort of in that framework. Because right now, I think there are criminal justice is very complex. Some of the other things are slightly easier, but criminal justice is in the U.S. is just a mess right now.
Sorry, can I follow
Yeah,
up
please.
on that for a second? So figuring out what programs are going to help people is also an interesting and important fairness and machine learning
Absolutely.
problem. There are a lot of people trying to assess a particular social program, and in order to do that, you need to collect data and you need to know it's a causal question. How much is this program going to help this person? Yeah.
Warning to the audience, I'm going to ask one question and then go to you. So now is the time to actually go and stand in front of that mic. So my question for you, Raid picked up, Sorrel, this is for you. Raid picked up a notion of consistency first. And I'm curious how this squares away with some of the group and individual fairness that you've been thinking about. How do you position consistency first as a framework, which in many ways is operationalized on the ground with what you're thinking about in terms of some of these technical questions?
Yeah, so I think my question there would be consistency with respect to what, right? Because it's always going to be consistency with respect to some measured information about an individual. And so then you have to decide, do you want to be sort of consistent across races, and what does that end up meaning, given that people are coming from very different contexts, and that's going to be reflected in the data.
Could become FactML.
Just trying to add letters, huh? Mark.
So I'm Mark McCarthy. I'm with the Software and Information Industry Association. I'm delighted to be here at this group. We just published an issue brief on algorithmic fairness, which I'd like to make available to all you guys. It's on my trade association's website. And the theme is that the industry wants to be part of an ongoing conversation on how to design fairness into the algorithms and how to monitor them so that in the continuing use they remain fair. That's the big picture message. The detail is we can probably learn a lot on how to do that by looking at the regulated industry, the people who have been constructing statistical models in housing and employment and insurance and credit for many, many years. And they try to handle this fairness issue through disparate impact analysis. They look to see if there's an adverse disproportionate effect on a protected class, whether there's a business reason for that, and whether or not there's a model that does a better job. And I do think that way of structuring the issue makes a lot of sense for a lot of people, especially the policymakers, the people that I deal with. And it seems to focus the issue on the real problem where help can come from the technical community, which is where is the alternative to the policy or procedure or algorithm that's in place that might be able to do a job that's almost as good but not quite. There's a quantitative trade-off there, and I think the world would be served if that kind of trade-off could be examined in more detail. You won't solve it. Once you get to the point where you've done a disparate impact analysis and there's a compelling business need and there's no alternative that's any better, you might be in a situation where you just have to make a value choice. You know, is this the kind of thing where we think accuracy is so important that we cannot let any other value intercede, or do we want to put some constraints on accuracy in terms of providing for more fairness? And there are
All right,
lots of
thank you, Mark.
examples in that area.
I think let's let folks respond. Folks want to respond?
Yeah, so there has actually been a whole lot of work on questions of trade-offs of fairness and accuracy from within this community. And the point that I want to sort of pick on a little bit there is that I think that when we're all, and I've done this in my own work as well, but so when we're all sort of thinking about trade-offs between fairness and accuracy, I think we also need to be aware of the fact that that is usually actually really a sort of consistency measure, consistency with respect to our previous decisions, and not necessarily accuracy in the sense of representing like some fundamental truth about what the correct decisions were, right? It's really about sort of replicating historical decisions, and that's the accuracy that we're referring to when we're talking about this trade-off.
And I mean, even if you extend that to say you're doing some sort of a trial and you have a control group and you can do accuracy in the future, it's still, I mean, accuracy is a pointless measure, right? We're saying accuracy means something else, and we don't really have, so let's say assume accuracy is the right metric and you've got 88% accuracy. So you've got 12% error. Error on whom? What kinds of people? Are you making equal errors on all types of? So I think we can simplify it by calling it a trade-off between accuracy and something else, but it's not that simple. It's much more complicated than that simplification that we often use.
Thank you. I'm going to, just a warning to those of you in line, you see that camera right behind you? It's staring at your head. Thanks. Go ahead.
Cool. I'm Michael Veal. I'm a researcher at University College London, between there and Government Office of Science, and also a researcher at the Royal Society on our machine learning streams for science policy and data governance. So I do work on what machine learning and ideas towards responsibility aims and responsible practices look like in the public sector right now. So we're going interviewing people across the public sector. And what you find is there's a lot of focus on the decision support and how you actually design these systems. A lot of them are designed in-house in Europe and in the UK rather than contracted out, or they're involved contractors. And there's concerns that things like releasing the logic behind the models will make people build inaccurate mental models of how these are used and start to judge on the risk scores, on the factors rather than the risk scores. And there are also solutions like that people are proposing, like creating using these risk scores just to order lists that are currently unordered to help people make decisions. So a kind of question would be, should we not be focusing more as a community as well on how this decision support is presented and what actually empirically happens when people work on it, and what is the best way of presenting decision support to enable fairness and understanding and judgment?
Cynthia, do you want?
Yes, we should definitely focus on this. I mean, I'm working with some visualization guys that are supposed, they're going to help. But I mean, I don't do user studies personally, but I think that there's definitely a decent realm of research to be done on how these things are used and how people interpret them.
Yeah, and I would say that I'm aware of some folks in the room who are starting to do that work, right?
So all of them find him afterwards. Warning. David.
Morning. It's been a great panel so far. Here's a somewhat open-ended question. I want to hear your thoughts on feedback cycles. So a lot of definitions of fairness are one-off definitions. You have a single example, single person, what is a fair prediction for that person? But then there's societal feedback issues, and often policy is made to try to address them. For example, affirmative action might be one where you try to say, oh, we're going to make what could be considered a slightly unfair decision for one individual, but that then is going to have a long-term impact.
Sorry, what's the question?
How should one model and think about feedback cycles when it comes to fairness?
I mean, I'll take this one for a little bit, which is that I think that's one of the most important things that we don't think about holistically. We talk about it within small silos. For example, search engine optimization is a place where we see some of those feedback cycles. we see it in these discrete moments in time. Obviously, many of the people in the room know LaTanya Sweeney's example, which is often used as an example around this. I think part of what's at stake as we start to put these algorithms and these data-centric systems in place, and to Raid's point, they're mostly not in place, but once they are, they become a tool in which you want to manipulate. And once you want to manipulate them, that's where it's not just the natural feedback cycles that we start to pay attention to, but the folks who have different interests starting to feed into the feedback cycle. And I think this is something that, both we have to think about technically, but we also have to think about socially. So, we mentioned the criminal justice context. It's one of the biggest challenges of predictive policing. We know that where we send police, they will increasingly, arrest people. And so if we sent them to NYU frats, we might be finding a lot of drug use that we're not otherwise paying attention to, but we're not. We're sending them to Harlem. And so this is that moment of where are the data that we're seeing getting biased by the structures that we've put in place because we haven't realized all of the various externalities of what we don't see. And so I think the other important aspect in all of this is to think about the data that we see as well as the data that we don't see. And really trying to model within, at least conceptually model in your head, what is the data that we aren't seeing and how is this affecting the models that we're building?
And I would just quickly add that there will be a couple of talks later today that will be talking about this in more depth.
Hello,
She knows all the papers. That's
Hello, my name is Richard Dunks, and I'm an independent consultant around data analytics. I work with city agencies, nonprofits in this space, and I'm firmly in Raid's camp, where it's just the start is really using data better and being more rational in the systems. But I also very much appreciate the fact that we need to have a conversation around the ethics, the impact, all those kinds of things. And data scientists are not conditioned, trained, experienced, interested in really assessing impact. Their focus is a little bit different. So while I appreciate that outside conversation, I'm also very conscious of how if you can't discern the difference between the probable and the possible in terms of machine learning, Cynthia Rudin pointed out about the hardness problems and things like that, it can be very easy to see a lot of danger where there isn't necessarily there. So I would encourage, if anyone in this room has not ever done a data science model or created a very basic one, it's a lot easier than you probably think, which actually can also show you how scary it is that people can very easily create models. I'm really interested, though, with this panel, your thoughts on this idea, the difference between probability and possibility, and in terms of discerning what are the actual threats or the actual concerns from those that aren't necessarily threats right now or not the most concerning thing that we should be focused on.
Let's pick that one up.
I guess I'm a little confused as to what types of threats. You mean threats in the way the models are going to be used, I guess? I'm not sure.
I mean, I think this is where we also see the dynamic between both what is statistically meaningful and what is culturally meaningful. Maybe I'll give it in a funny way, which is that I've been fascinated by a struggle that the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration has. You would think that their data is clean and simple, right? But they know that they've got massive problems. They've got sensor problems. They've got all sorts of things. The other thing is they're operating in probabilities. Just think the weather for a second, right? The weather is not something that we know. It's a probabilistic model. So what does it mean then where they have to transfer that probability into something that is about narrating publicly a possibility? There is a hurricane that may possibly hit your geographic thing. And then, of course, what happens when that gets political, right? When you have, let's just say a governor deciding to turn it into a big fiasco, and then how does the public respond? And so I think we get these interesting moments where we think about things in terms of building a meaningful, holistic, probabilistic system, and we want to be as accurate and responsible as possible to the data that we see. But the moment that these things become part of an impact story or part of a possibility narrative, they have a whole set of different implications. And I think that's where it becomes this interesting challenge for us, is how do we convey those models when we know that people not just can't read causality, they can't read probability, right? So, how do we deal with some of that as it plays out?
I think we probably also want to put costs into our models, make them real decision analysis models. Maybe the right thing to do would be this, but it's going to cost us this much. Maybe we shouldn't do that. Like this person maybe, like you were saying, yesterday this person should have been in jail, but now we've run out of space. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, also, I think that's where the intersection, in order to get these things into policy, there is law in the middle, right? We have to turn them into laws. So law is not going to say how you maybe it's say how you calculate the probability, but assume the probability is correct. You then have to put some decision threshold, right? And so that's where you can start being precise. Is my policy, so if your platform is, I'm going to only take action when the probability for this thing is greater than 0.79, you can have a range. But I think that's where you start getting people to be more explicit. And if these decisions are getting a little bit more automated, it's riskier, but it's also, forces them to define their policy and define the outcome they care about and what the trade-offs are. And I think that's a good thing in the long term. In the short term, it might hurt us more. But I think forcing government agencies to be very transparent about what is the policy that they have, not in a hand-wavy 100-page report, but in a, here is the probability I'll take action on, here's how I'll evaluate the probability, here's who I want to be fair to, here's who I'm okay being unfair to. Because if you're being fair to some people, you're being unfair to other people. Like that's just going to be, and it's okay because we're defining that. So I think a lot of it is how do we write down these things so that policymakers understand them, and then the people being impacted understand them as well.
So recognizing time, I'm going to ask each of you to state your question as quickly as possible, and then we'll respond collectively with closing statements in relation to your questions.
Thank you so much for the very interesting discussion so far. My question is coming from someone who's outside the machine learning community. It sounds like a lot of you are talking about the machine learning community as a single community, a monolith. And I was wondering if you think that it's possible or even healthy for there to be a single framework or principles put out, like you mentioned there's some on the website already, or do you imagine there being multiple communities that arise in the future, a more conservative community, a more progressive community, and then also different frameworks depending on different fields, like a criminal justice, machine learning framework, and so on and so forth?
I'm going to ask each of you, yeah.
Oh, sure, yes. My question is just, are you seriously saying that transparency is a red herring? I can point to 15, 20 students, colleagues in the room who made fantastic work to reveal what is being done online, who gave those results to either computational journalists or social scientists to look at the bigger picture. I think there's also a danger in trying as engineers to think about fairness. I think there are people with better training than us. So I see myself as a very, very strong opponent to any attack on transparency. So I just want a clarification.
Perfect.
I was wondering, since it seems that there's an inherent, that machine learning inherently gives more power to entities that can collect lots of data, that have large surveillance capabilities. And I was wondering if you think that it's possible for machine learning research to be a democratizing force, and how to shape your research around that sort of power distribution.
Fabulous.
Hi, Daniel Neal from Carnegie Mellon. I was wondering what should be the role of machine learning in quantifying and controlling for human implicit biases? So that source of fuzziness in human decision that's not such a good one.
Great. So I'm going to ask each of you to respond collectively to the questions, and this is the closing statements effectively. Maybe Cynthia, can you start? Oh, sorry.
I need to think about some of those questions.
I can actually jump in
Okay,
if you want. So sort of responding to the first question, which was about the potential for essentially separating into different communities. I guess what I would say is that I would hope that we could actually sort of remain one community, even if we end up on sort of different sides of sort of various value propositions, because I think that that's sort of as a technical community, it's really important that we all sort of be able to talk to each other and think about sort of different models for what we mean by fairness, and wrestle through the technical implications together, right? And I would expect that there might be some people who are occasionally on both sides of the fence. And I also want to recognize that sort of even within a technical community, at this point we're no longer really just machine learning. There are people in the room from lots of other pieces of the technical community, and I think it's also good that we continue to speak about these issues across those technical boundaries as well.
Okay, I think I'd like to respond to Daniel's question. So he's asking about human implicit biases, and it would be really interesting if the machine could sort of have a discussion with the decision maker. you know, the machine says, look, this person is actually low risk. And the human says, but I really think looking at this person that they're high risk. And then the computer could say, well, maybe that's because you're sort of biased. This is the sort of, you know, this is the distribution of what humans would think. But actually the risk score is sort of over here. And then the human could say, no, but your data's wrong, you know, something like that would sort of allow the combination of the two to make a good decision together. And I think a system like that would be really cool. So, good question.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great. I think on the community side, I strongly feel that we need to have a single-ish community, because the work, and it wasn't obvious to me until I started looking at, you know, criminal justice and public safety and education and health, and working with governments across all of those areas. All of these challenges are very similar, and they're all very connected. And so if we all go off into our corners and do these things separately, we're not really going to get anywhere, because we need a lot of help from each other in convincing people, both in using these things, but also in kind of being aware of what could go wrong in one area versus other. So I think it's important to deal with that. I think one of the things we have to sort of be careful. So one sort of kind of closing thing is that you know, we're having a wonderful discussion here. This discussion rarely, if ever, happens in any, let's call it, training program in machine learning, or, you know, grad school. No grad student has really had this discussion as part of a curriculum. And so I think one thing I feel strongly about is extending this into having these things not as a separate course, because then you do it for one semester, quarter, and you move on. As part of every course, one of the things we tried in one of the programs we run is every Friday we would have this discussion about the phase of the project you're in. Let's talk about implications of that phase on all of these things. On if you're doing data collection, fairness and ethics and transparency, if you're doing modeling, if you're doing evaluation, if you're doing metric selection, if you're doing communication. So I think that's kind of like, this needs to happen a lot more. It doesn't have to be, definitely shouldn't be 3 or 4 people here, or even this room. And if we can figure out a way to at least help people create these, what is the curriculum, that we can embed, that'll be great.
So I'm realizing we're out of time. I want to sort of conclude for a moment. I totally want to take up the transparency debate, and I'm happy to talk with everybody at lunch about this. I think the thing that I would say to all of this is, you know, one thing from the social science community is don't assume that the goals you're trying to achieve will be what you achieve through your intervention. And I'll give you just a concrete example from autonomous systems. So Madeline Ellish, I'm not sure if she's here, has worked with Tim Huang, who's there. And one of the things they did is they looked at the history of automation in the federal aviation context. And one of the things that came out was the idea of like how important it was to put humans in the loop as we went to autopilot. The planes you all flew on to get here, for those of you who fly at all, are actually pretty much autonomous at this point. And what that human in the loop means at this point is that their main role is to serve as a liability sponge. They basically pick up where things go terribly awry, except they've been de-skilled on the job. They don't actually do that work anymore. And they only solve it when there's a real big problem. So that's where we create these moral crumple zones. And at moment where, you know, like a car has a crumple zone where we put humans in that crumple zone. And their paper on this is beautiful. But the reason I bring this up is like, let's be really cautious as we go with a lot of these values that we're not actually unintendedly creating moral crumple zones throughout these kinds of systems as we're trying to achieve fairness, accountability, and transparency. And that becomes a really important thing to stay with, because I think our intentions are good, but our outcomes may not play out the way we would like them to. With that in mind, it's time for some more fun talks from different people. So thank you, and thank you to the panel.
Hey folks, so obviously we're sorting through a few technical challenges up here, but while we're doing that, I wanted to invite the folks who are in the next Spotlight session to come up here and sit in these lovely chairs. And I also wanted to give sort of a brief intro to the session. Come on up, it's fine. So this Spotlight session, our goal here is, as it sounds, to spotlight some of the work that we've seen in this area in the past year that's published that we think are really shining examples of some of the best work. So we do sort of encourage you, even though we've only given them sort of 5 minutes, which is really only a short amount of time to tell you about the deep work that they've done, we do encourage you to go and actually read the papers and sort of grapple with the true extent of the work that they're going to be presenting quickly. Okay, folks, technical challenges resolved. So we're going to try and do this. I also wanted to say, for folks standing in the back, you're welcome to come and sit in the front.
There's a lot of seats.
I know people don't often like to do that, but you really are welcome. Okay, and so with that said, thank you to this really exciting panel. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you all are too.
I guess I can start. Okay, so I'm gonna be talking about I'm Natis Fibro. This is work with Moritz Hart and Eric Price on trying to define and see how to work with non-discrimination and supervised learning. And I don't think here I have to describe why this is desirable to have introduce non-discrimination constraints into supervised learning. Just what I do want to emphasize is what I'm setting. So we're talking about non-discrimination. We're talking non-discrimination not in general decision-making, but specifically in supervised learning. So when there's a prediction task, when we're trying to predict, there's a well-defined target that we're trying to predict based on some collected attributes. And we want to do this prediction in a way that's non-discriminatory with respect to some specified protected attribute or group, like race or gender. So what we want is to build a predictor for Y that's based on the features or maybe even also the protected attribute in a way that does not discriminate with respect to this group or this attribute. Okay? And the main thing we're grappling with is what does it mean in this setting to be non-discriminating? Okay? So I have to say, when I started working on this, we're talking non-discrimination in machine learning. All we do in machine learning is discrimination. I mean, machine learning first lecture, how to build a discriminator. Okay? So the goal is that we want to discriminate, but not based on the attribute. Okay, so the kind of two maybe baselines. One is blindness, and you just don't use the attribute. And this is, of course, not sufficient because we can pretty efficiently predict the attribute from the other features and then either intentionally or inadvertently use it. And also, there's another issue here which I think is important in our work, which is even if we don't use it really not even implicitly, then blindness doesn't address the issue of accuracy disparity. Our predictor might be much more accurate in one group rather than another, and this also can often be seen as discriminatory. Another option to look at is demographic parity. So demographic parity, which was also mentioned earlier today, says that we're going to make the same, the distribution for recommendations or predictions is going to be the same in both groups, right? So we're going to have, if we're going to recommend giving or predict non-default unknown for 60% of the white population, we're also going to predict 60% on the black population. Or another way to say it is that our predictor should be statistically independent of the protected attribute. Now, there are two problems with this. So one is it's too strict, and I think people appreciate it because remember that our task that we're looking here is a non-discrimination in the supervised learning task, where our task is to predict Y. We're not looking at whether Y itself is discriminatory or not, right? We're just looking at, do we want to predict Y? We want to predict non-default on a loan, or we want to predict appearance at some later date. And if the correct predictor actually correlates with A, it's a bit much to expect that the predictor would not correlate. In particular, we do want to allow perfect prediction. Right? So if the perfect predictor, which means that we predict exactly the truth, does not satisfy demographic parity. Okay? And it's, so this precludes, for example, giving loans to exactly those people that we know exactly are going to non-default. Okay? Or not releasing on bail exactly those people that we know are actually going to not show up. The other problem with demographic parity is it's also too weak. So it doesn't protect from accuracy disparity. So for example, we're allowed, according to demographic parity, to give loans to all qualified white people, among white people, exactly give loans to qualified people, and black people just flip a coin, okay, as long as the bias of the coin matches. So our definition is as follows. Our suggested definition is that adding the conditioning on Y. So that's saying that it's not that the prediction has to be independent of the protected attribute. It has to be independent, conditioned on the truth. So another way to think about it is that we know that knowing the true outcome tells us something about the protected attribute. But once we know the true outcome, knowing the prediction should not tell us additional information. It doesn't give us additional information about the true outcome. And this does protect from accuracy disparity and does allow the perfect predictor. So there's much more in the paper, but I'm getting signal that this is the end of the time. So just tell you what you can find in the paper. So first of all, there's discussion on how to computationally efficiently find optimally correct discriminatory predictors to be not discriminatory according to this definition. There's some interpretation in terms of our C-curve and the incentive structure. And also I want to focus on this last bullet here. We talked quite lengthily about the inherent limitation of oblivious tests that are only based, like ours and like demographic parity and like many others, they're only based on viewing the prediction as a black box. And we show some non-defeasibility results of saying that you cannot distinguish between two things and argue why our definition is in some sense more accurate than the definition both North Point calls target population errors or what others might call calibration accuracy. Thank you.
Morning. Okay, so I'm going to pick up where that talk left off and assume that you interpreted all of that correctly. 5-minute talks are difficult. Okay, so the work I'm talking about today is motivated by all of these settings that we've talked about so far. The idea of using machine learning for hiring decisions, for lending decisions, policing, sentencing, parole, any setting in which we're thinking about using machine learning algorithms to pick individuals. And individuals may have some inherent quality for the task at hand. For example, the expected revenue of giving a loan to an individual. And moreover, that quality of an individual entitles high-quality individuals to access to some resource that you are allocating. Right? For example, people who are going to make a bank a lot of money should have more access to the loans that are being allocated. And all of these settings, we're thinking of there being some features which are available to the bank or the algorithm, which the bank is making a decision as a function of. And the learning algorithm is actually trying to learn a relationship between the observable features and the qualities at hand. Okay? And I want to assume, just as mentioned previously, that these may be different for different groups, because not doing so might actually allow for other sorts of bias to creep into the models that we're learning. So one source of bias in machine learning that was briefly mentioned in the Q&A before is the idea that there may be some kind of data feedback loop, right? If I think certain people are low quality, I may never give them loans and never see whether or not they would have paid those loans back, right? So we're going to instantiate this and think about a particular model in which this might be the case and sort of discover what kinds of fairness definitions are reasonable here. So in particular, we study a particular notion of fairness which enforces that machine learning algorithms have to treat high-quality individuals at least as well as low-quality individuals. and we study the cost of such a constraint in terms of the learning rate that's defined in a particular technical way. Right? And I want to focus on the fact that this is actually saying something about the process of learning a fair model rather than learning through being fair throughout that process, rather than just taking a black box model and turning it into something that we think of as more fair. So the setting I want to think about is there being k different groups, each of which has some function which maps qualities, or maps from features to qualities, that these may be unknown and different for different groups. Right? And on each day, I want to think about there being an individual from each group represented by some feature vector, right? And that the bank, or the algorithm, is going to pick one of those people. One of those people is going to get a loan on each day. And as a result, the bank actually sees whether or not that person paid it back, right? I get some information about the person I chose and nothing about the remaining people. And the goal in such a setting is usually to maximize the expected average quality of the people you're choosing, right? So the definition that we study is the following. We say an algorithm is fair if given any failure probability with all the remaining probability for any sequence of features that we've seen so far, for all rounds, and for all pairs of groups, if the expected quality of the person from group I at time t is at least as large as the expected quality of the person from group j at time t, I want the algorithm to treat I at least as well as j. And what I mean by that is just some probabilistic thing, right? The algorithm is going to have some probability of picking each. I want the probability to be at least as high for I as for j. Okay? So the first technical thing that I'll say about this paper is that this costs something, right? Even in the setting where I have no features that I'm predicting as a function of, the best learning rate I can get, subject to this constraint, is higher. It's a slower learning rate than in the case without such a constraint, right? So that's what this says here. Don't worry about parsing the precise technical definition. Okay? This obviously remains once we look at a setting where we actually do have features. But precisely how much more we lose in terms of our learning rate depends on the particularities of the problem. Right? So for example, one thing we do say is that when this mapping between features and qualities is linear, we can get non-trivial learning rates. But if the mapping is much more complicated, such as the set of conjunctions, right, we sort of are forced to experience exponential diminishment in terms of our learning rates. Okay. So there's a great amount of related work, some of which is done by the people who are currently talking on this panel. But I want to emphasize that this work primarily focuses on sort of the process of learning a fair model and being fair in that process, rather than just taking a model and modifying it to be fair. So in conclusion, our work introduces a particular new notion of fairness, which sort of embeds the idea that high-quality people deserve to be treated at least as well as lower-quality individuals. And sort of one technical thing that I didn't get any chance to talk about is that an implication of this is sort of that you have to be confident about relative qualities of individuals before you can exploit information about people. And there's going to be some cost to satisfying such a constraint, and it will depend on precisely the parameters of your problem, what that cost will be. Great. Thanks.
Well, it doesn't matter.
Thanks. So I'm going to discuss the paper Combating Police Discrimination in the Age of Big Data, which is joint work with Sharad Goyal, Maya Perelman, and David Sklansky. So this paper examines big data and police discrimination in the context of New York City's stop, question, frisk policy, and discusses the legal implications of a statistical technique that we call stop-level hit rate analysis, or SHR analysis. So stop and frisk is a policy of investigative stops, which are also called Terry stops after the 1968 Supreme Court decision Terry versus Ohio, where officers briefly detain an individual given reasonable suspicion that crime is afoot and conduct a pat-down if they suspect the individual is armed and dangerous. Stop-level hit rate analysis uses a statistical model to calculate the ex-ante likelihood based on the information available to the officer at the time the stop is conducted, that a Terry stop will be successful. That is, it'll result in finding what the officers suspect they'll find. In other words, stop level hit rates are numerical estimates of the likelihood that the suspicion motivating a stop will turn out to be correct. So in our paper, we outline 3 applications of SHR analysis. So first, police departments can use SHR analysis to improve the efficiency and fairness of their stop and frisk practices. Second, courts can use SHR analysis to assess whether a police department has engaged in illegal discrimination in violation of the 14th Amendment. And third, courts can use SHR analysis also to assess whether or not stops were supported by reasonable and articulable suspicion or not in violation of the 4th Amendment. So, speaking to efficiency and fairness, the plot here displays by race the model estimated distribution of stop level hit rates for stops where the suspected crime is criminal possession of a weapon. So the dashed line here indicates the 1% probability. So you can notice that many stops have a low likelihood of weapon recovery, and this differs by race. So whereas 20% of white stops have less than a 1% SHR, 50% of black stops have a similarly low likelihood. So this suggests that if you eliminated low likelihood stops, if you eliminated stops where the chance of recovering a weapon was less than 1%, you could simultaneously increase the efficiency of your stop practice while achieving greater racial balance. So similarly, SHR analysis has 3 features that should appeal to courts that have been wary on relying on less powerful kinds of statistical proof of discrimination. So first, at the individual stop level, SHR analysis can provide evidence of discrimination. Second, SHR analysis can counter a common neutral explanation for racial disparities in stop rates, namely aggressive policing in high crime areas, as the cause of observed racial disparities. And moreover, because SHR analysis can be used by police departments to increase the efficiency of their stops while simultaneously decreasing the racially disproportionate impact, failure to make use of the lessons of SHR analysis may be evidence of discriminatory intent. So our paper also makes the argument that the assessment of constitutionality of police stop policies needs to consider such policies as programs and not just isolated occurrences of individual stops. In particular, the constitutionality of a stop policy depends on the reasonableness of the program, which depends in part on the hit rate, and that's where SHR analysis comes in. The costs and benefits of a stop and frisk program need to be considered in determining a numerical threshold for reasonable suspicion, and we argue that it should weigh against a finding of reasonableness that the program disproportionately burdens racial minorities or any other traditionally disadvantaged groups. So in conclusion, our paper makes 3 broad points. So first, the potential uses of big data to make policing more fair and more effective are just beginning to be discovered. New tools of police accountability warrant re-examination of traditional rules and assumptions pertaining to legal oversight of the police. And Terry stops should be analyzed not as isolated interactions, but as programs. That's how they're implemented, that's how they tend to be experienced, and that's how to make best use of the tools of oversight provided by big data. Thanks.
Sorry, guys, yeah.
Okay, so a little change of sequence here. One of the people who is on the spotlight couldn't join us in person, but she actually submitted a video, so I thought maybe I'll play the video. Hopefully this will work.
Hi, my name is Jenna Burrell, and I'm an associate professor at the School of Information at UC Berkeley. I am here to tell you about a paper I wrote this past year titled How the Machine Thinks, Understanding Opacity in Machine Learning Algorithms. which was published with the journal Big Data and Society early this past year. I wanted to just give some background about the paper and try to entice you to read it. So I decided to write this paper for a couple of reasons. I was starting to see a number of social scientists participating in this really interesting discussion about the politics of algorithms. My training's in sociology, but I have a background in computer science, so I thought it might be an interesting opportunity to kind of merge those areas of expertise. And in particular, while the discussion about algorithms was fairly broad, I was really interested in a particular class of algorithms called machine learning algorithms, which were of kind of increasing importance and application in many domains. One thing I noticed in the sort of emerging discussion about the politics of algorithms was a sort of ambiguity about what was at the source of their opacity. And I think often the opacity of those algorithms was really blamed on corporate and state secrecy. The assumption was that if you could read the code, you could figure out how things were being classified the way they were, and to determine whether or not there was some problem of bias or a lack of fairness in those categorization practices. And from what I knew about machine learning algorithms, I suspected that was not really entirely a fair assessment of what the source of opacity in algorithms was really about. So I wrote this paper where I argued that opacity could really be divided into 3 types. The first type of opacity is indeed problems of algorithms being proprietary or corporations wanting to protect and keep secret how their algorithms are written, because that's what sort of gives them an edge. And often that can be a cover for things like bias in algorithms. I think if you want to read about that, certainly Frank Pasquale's book, The Black Box Society, talks about that sort of thing at length. Another type of opacity that seemed to be at the source of what many people were talking about, what had to do with the fact that reading and writing code is really a specialist skill, and not everybody has that capacity. Some ways of addressing that might be, getting more kids and young people to learn how to code, or including learning to code in higher education for students who are not necessarily majoring in or studying computer science. But really the third form of opacity, which I wanted to argue was incredibly important and significant to consider, had to do with a mismatch between mathematical optimization in high dimensionality, which is what you really see with things like machine learning algorithms, and the demands of human scale reasoning and styles of semantic interpretation. So let me say a little bit more about what that means. And this gets to the reason I titled this paper, How the Machine Thinks, because I wanted to draw sort of a distinction between how a machine might mathematically optimize data and how a human would try and make sense of and understand and come to some sort of semantic understanding of what those classifications really mean. So this centers around the question of interpretation. And certainly interpretation is not just a concern for people like me who consider ourselves to be interpretivists. That term is actually something that many computer scientists are concerned about. So if you have a machine learning algorithm which basically takes a massive pile of data and finds some patterns and regularities in that data, those patterns and regularities are potentially useful whether or not you can understand them, but for many reasons it may be really important for a human to understand why an algorithm classified something one way or the other. And to explore that question, I decided to look at spam filtering. And the reason I was interested in spam filtering is because I'd spent a lot of time in West Africa, specifically in Ghana. A nearby country to Ghana is Nigeria, and many people know Nigeria for the email scams that originate from that country. And so I really wondered after some time in Ghana whether if you're sending email from Ghana or Nigeria, if you have a fair shot at keeping your emails out of spam filters. Are you more likely, if you're sending an email from Ghana or Nigeria or making reference in your email to Ghana or Nigeria, are you more likely to see your emails end up in the spam folder? Legitimate emails is really, I think, the important question. So are Ghanaians and Nigerians disadvantaged in their ability to use email to send messages to people by virtue of the fact that they're from those countries? And that, to me, of course, would seem like a big problem of fairness. I won't tell you what I found when I actually ran some code and sort of tested out this question, but all of that is contained in my paper. And I spent some time trying to describe and explain how machine learning algorithms work for a non-expert audience, and to actually think about the design of those algorithms and to think about the code. And I think what you will learn from reading my paper is that there are limits to the ways we can audit algorithms simply by just reading the code, and that there are some very kind of hard, inescapable forms of opacity, specifically with the use of machine learning algorithms, that it's important to be aware of and to consider. I hope you read my paper, and I hope you enjoyed the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency workshop. Thanks.
All right, hi, I'm Christiane Lum from the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. And I'm going to be talking about some work I've done with William Isaac, who is sitting right here. Was that little striped blue and red striped shirt, purple shirt here in the front, who is equally qualified to answer any questions as I am. So if anyone has any questions afterwards, you can see me, or you can also see William. So what I'm going to be talking about today is machine learning, and in particular, machine learning as applied to police records, which is called predictive policing. And because I only have a few minutes today to talk, I'm going to assert a few things that normally I would spend a little bit more time explaining and trying to convince you are true. But for the machine learning people in the audience, maybe you can just nod your head and agree with me that this is true. And for the non-machine learning people in the audience, maybe you can just go ahead and believe me for a second. All right, so the first thing I'm going to assert is if you take statistically biased data and feed it into a machine learning algorithm, that algorithm will reproduce the biases in the data that it was trained with. I see a lot of nodding heads. If this isn't something that you're aware of, then you don't just have to trust me. You can look around here also. All right. The second fact is that police records are biased. And there's a little bit of an unfortunate collision of terminology here in the sense that I'm talking about statistically biased. You might also think of them bias in the more colloquial sense, but here I'm just talking about statistical bias, meaning some crimes that occur in the area of study, so in a city, are more likely to appear in the police records than others. And this seems relatively straightforward. One example of the way in which this could occur is areas where police patrol heavily, or more crimes that occur in those areas are more likely to be observed simply because that's where the police are looking. So again, you don't have to believe me. You probably should, but this is the thing I'm just going to be asserting. All right, so the point of the paper that William and I wrote was that we wanted to bring an example to show to people to illustrate the point that if you apply machine learning algorithms to police records, you can end up with these feedback loops. And this has been something that people have been discussing for a while, but we hadn't seen any really concrete evidence of this, and we hadn't seen any examples on real data with real algorithms that demonstrated how this should happen. So that's the goal of what I'm going to show you now. So in the upper left-hand corner, we took some data from the Oakland Police Department. This is on openoakland.org. And this shows the number of crimes per bin. So we binned up the space of Oakland. Areas that are bright red or pink show where they found a lot of crimes. These are drug crimes, by the way. So drug crime reports is not just arrests, it's crime reports. So anything they found or was reported to them or they came to know about. And you can see there's basically two locations where the police were finding significant number of drug crimes. So one is up here, and this is West Oakland, and this is the brightest spot right here. And the other area is right along down here, and this is right kind of ish along International Boulevard. That's the best description of this location that I could find. All right. You can compare this to this map here, and I've sort of done the best I could to match up the line in the circle here to a demographic dot map that shows the racial composition of the city of Oakland. So the blue dots correspond to white people, the green dots over here and somewhat over here correspond to black residents of Oakland, Asian are represented by red dots, and Hispanic people are represented by orange dots. And there should be a citation down there. If there's not, I will be tweeting this out again because I needed to add that to the slide. And so you can see that they're really only finding crimes in essentially the African-American neighborhood, or they're predominantly finding crimes in the African-American neighborhood and the Hispanic neighborhood. And this is in contrast to, and again, this is something I'm just going to assert, but people are doing drugs everywhere in Oakland. They're not just doing drugs in these two places. Again, you're just gonna have to believe me, but we explored that a little bit too. That's true. Okay. And so what we did was we applied a predictive policing algorithm to the data from 2010 that I'm showing you here to make a prediction for each day in 2011 to see where the police would have been sent if you'd applied the predictive policing algorithm and sent the police to where the algorithm tells you to send them. Those are the red squares on this map. The black dots are where they were actually finding crime in 2011. And so if the algorithm were actually making things more representative or less biased, we would see red squares everywhere because like I'm asserting, drug crime is everywhere in Oakland. Instead, what we find is that the algorithm just sends the police officers right back to the locations that were already really overrepresented in the data, areas that I would describe as possibly over-policed in the data. And so in this sense, the algorithm has actually reinforced the bias that's in the data. And if when they go there, they find a little bit more crime than they would have found anyway, that bias is going to be amplified. So even if the data didn't begin as biased, it will become biased simply by applying this sort of technique. And so I saw my time is about up, so I'll just let this run for a second, bask in the movie. I always like movies, and thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to be up here on such a great panel.